The fluorescent lights in the conference room hummed a low, steady note that seemed to vibrate right through the polished mahogany table between us. I sat with my hands folded, resting against the cool wood, watching the man shifting in the leather chair across from me. He no longer registered as my partner of 6 years. His silk tie hung loose against a collar that suddenly looked a half size too small. A thin sheen of moisture coated his upper lip, and his eyes darted toward the frosted glass exit door like an animal searching for a gap in a fence. I did not feel grief looking at him. I did not feel pity. My mind, trained by a decade of managing global supply chains, simply categorized him the way I would a defunct vendor. He was no longer my husband. He was a hostile asset, and I was about to liquidate him. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled his carefully constructed double life, step by calculated step, I want you to drop your age in the comments. I truly believe it takes a certain number of years on this earth to learn the hard difference between genuine partnership and pure financial exploitation. Welcome to Sarah Told Stories, where we explore the moments that force us to rewrite our own realities. The path to this sterile room started exactly 4 months earlier, on a morning so cold the frost had formed thick crystalline webs across our kitchen windows. I stood alone by the marble island in our home in Manchester, New Hampshire. The bitter scent of dark roast coffee lingered in the air, but my stomach was too tight for breakfast. My fingers traced the edge of a single sheet of paper. The letterhead belonged to a regional cardiology center. Below the billing address, printed in heavy black ink, was a number that had stolen my breath the moment I opened the envelope. $18,400. My father, Carlos, was a man who built his entire life around the Granite State motto. Live free or die was not just a phrase stamped on a license plate for him. It was the posture he carried himself with every single day. His hands were mapped with pale scars from decades spent working on the floor of a smart manufacturing plant, turning wrenches and managing heavy machinery until his joints grew stiff. He was a proud man who never asked anyone for a dime. But his heart had betrayed him a month prior. An emergency stent saved his life, but a bureaucratic gap during his transition to a new healthcare plan left him exposed to the out-of-pocket costs. For a supply chain director accustomed to moving millions of dollars in medical tech inventory, $18,400 was a manageable data point. But standing in my kitchen, looking at the debt assigned to my aging father, it felt like an emergency. I had the money, or rather, we had the money. My 6-figure salary had always flowed directly into our shared accounts. I just needed to access it. The heavy door connecting the garage to the kitchen swung open, letting in a sharp gust of winter wind. Derek walked in. He smelled of fresh snow and expensive cedar cologne. He wore a tailored wool suit that cost more than my first car, and his pristine Italian leather briefcase swung lightly from his right hand. He did not look up to greet me. His eyes were locked downward, reflecting the harsh blue light of his smartphone screen. His thumb swiped downward repeatedly, refreshing whatever page held his attention. I watched the tension tight in his jaw. I assumed the high-maintenance client was threatening to back out of a morning deal. I justified his distraction the way I always did. I had no idea he was watching a live sports scoreboard, sweating over a point spread that was quietly bleeding him dry. Derek, my dad's hospital statement arrived. I said, keeping my tone level as I slid the paper across the smooth marble counter. He stopped walking, but he did not look up from the screen. It is $18,400 out of pocket. I continued watching his thumb freeze over his phone. I need to pull from the joint savings this week to clear it before it hits his credit. Derek let out a long breath through his nose. The sound carried a distinct note of irritation, as if I had just asked him to run a trivial errand. He pocketed his phone adjusting his silver cufflinks before finally looking at the hospital bill. He did not pick it up. Instead, he placed his index finger on the center of the page and pushed it back across the marble until it hung precariously over the edge. "Justine, we have talked about financial boundaries," he said. His voice was smooth, practiced, and entirely devoid of warmth. I stared at him. My chest felt suddenly hollow. We had never talked about financial boundaries. From the month we got married, my direct deposits had been routed straight into the centralized accounts he insisted on managing. He worked in finance, and I traveled constantly for supply chain logistics. I handed over my paychecks for convenience and out of a deep, misplaced trust. "He is my father," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the tremor starting in my hands. "And it is our joint savings. I put $10,000 into that account just last month." Derek picked up his briefcase from the counter. The twin brass clasps snapped shut with a hollow, dismissive sound that echoed sharply against the kitchen tile. "I am not funding Carlos," he said, turning his back to me and walking toward the hallway. "Your parents are your problem. Your money is yours. My money is mine." He did not pause to look over his shoulder. He did not wait for a response. The front door opened and shut with a heavy thud, leaving me standing alone in the quiet kitchen. A lesser version of me might have cried. A different woman might have chased him down the frozen driveway, begging for a conversation, demanding basic empathy from the man she married. But I did not move. A creeping cold settled deep in my bones, replacing the panic with a startling crystalline clarity. Growing up in New Hampshire teaches you early on that survival means adapting to the freeze. When a supply chain breaks down, you do not stand around yelling at the broken link. You bypass it. You audit the failure and you secure your cargo. Your parents are your problem. Your money is yours. My money is mine. The words hung in the air, wrapping around me until they stopped feeling like an insult and started feeling like a set of instructions. I picked up the hospital bill and folded it neatly into a perfect square, tucking it into my pocket. "Okay, Derek," I whispered to the empty room. My money is mine. I did not go to work that morning. I walked straight up the stairs and down the hall to our home office. I sat in his heavy leather desk chair and booted up my personal laptop. For 6 years, I had let him play the role of the financial protector, trusting his spreadsheets and his confident assurances about our growing portfolio. I had never bothered to track the routing numbers hidden beneath the surface of our domestic life. That blind trust ended the moment his briefcase snapped shut. I opened a new browser window, pulled up our banking portal, and decided it was time to find out exactly where my money was going. The home office felt like a walk-in freezer. I sat in Derek's heavy leather desk chair, staring at the login screen of our joint banking portal. The cursor blinked a steady, rhythmic pulse against the stark white background. For 6 years, I had treated this digital space as his exclusive domain. He was the wealth manager, the man who navigated the complexities of compounding interest and diversified portfolios, while I spent my days analyzing global freight routes and manufacturing delays. I had trusted his financial stewardship entirely. That was my first mistake. In supply chain logistics, we adhere to a fundamental rule. You never assume the physical inventory matches the digital ledger until you physically count the boxes yourself. I had stopped counting my own boxes a long time ago. I typed in the password and pressed enter. The dashboard loaded immediately, populating rows of numbers, bar charts, and transaction histories. My eyes scanned the summary page, searching for anomalies. Everything looked standard at first glance. The mortgage cleared on time, the utility drafts aligned with our usual consumption, the grocery expenses matched our typical weekend habits, but I was not looking for the standard baseline. I was looking for the bleed. I exported 48 months of transaction history into a large spreadsheet. 4 solid years of our financial life reduced to thousands of digital rows. I widened the columns, applying a series of custom tracking filters I typically use to locate lost international cargo shipments. I isolated my direct deposits first. Every 2 weeks, a substantial sum from my corporate employer dropped into the primary checking account. Then I tracked where that capital moved. A pattern emerged within seconds. It was a clean, automated transfer occurring on the first of every single month without fail. $2,500 shifting out of the primary account and disappearing into an external destination. The description text attached to the recurring transfer was meticulously labeled. Vanguard Tech ETF. I stared at those 3 words, feeling a strange mix of confusion and misplaced relief. An exchange-traded fund. It looked incredibly responsible. It mirrored the very medical tech industry I worked in, making the investment seem even more logical. For 4 years, whenever Derek showed me our quarterly summaries, he would point to the tech sector growth on his tablet and smile. He would tell me our future was secure and our retirement was compounding beautifully. Because the label looked legitimate, and because I loved the man sitting across the dinner table, I never once thought to click on the underlying routing data. Why would a wife investigate her husband for saving for their shared future? But today was different. Today, my father needed a life-saving medical stent, and my husband had told me to fend for myself. I highlighted the Vanguard Tech ETF cell and initiated a deep trace. The beauty of modern banking is that capital leaves a permanent digital footprint, no matter how cleverly someone masks the file name. I pulled up the raw transaction receipt, focusing on the destination routing number. It did not match the institutional code for Vanguard. It did not match any major brokerage firm on Wall Street. My stomach plummeted. A sudden wave of nausea rushed up my throat, forcing me to push away from the desk and press my palms flat against my thighs. My breathing grew shallow, and the silence of the empty house pressed heavily against my ears. If the money was not going into a secured investment vehicle, where was it going? The most obvious answer slammed into my chest like a physical strike. Another woman. I pictured a secret apartment, a hidden life, a mistress, receiving a steady, generous allowance courtesy of my grueling 60-hour work weeks. The thought made my skin crawl with betrayal. I forced myself to roll the chair back to the desk, gripping the edge of the wood to steady my hands. I needed hard proof. I copied the phantom routing number and opened a new browser tab, cross-referencing the digits through an open-source financial directory. The search icon spun for 3 agonizing seconds. The results populated on the screen. The routing number did not belong to a romantic rival. It belonged to a regional credit union based in southern Massachusetts. And the destination account name was not hidden behind a sophisticated corporate shell. It was plainly registered as G&P Expenses. Gerald and Patricia. Derek's parents. The air left my lungs. I sat paralyzed, watching the cursor blink next to his parents' names. My mind raced backward, calculating the sheer magnitude of the deception. $2,500 a month, multiplied by 12 months, multiplied by 4 years. $120,000. Derek had systematically siphoned $120,000 of my income to fund his parents' lifestyle. I pictured Gerald and Patricia clearly in my mind. They were people who constantly complained about the rising cost of living while casually booking luxury river cruises through Europe. They drove premium imported cars and hosted lavish, catered holiday parties, serving expensive wine in crystal glasses. I had always assumed Gerald possessed a brilliant pension from his previous corporate career. I had no idea I was the pension. I was the silent, oblivious sponsor of their wealthy facade. The sheer hypocrisy of the morning argument echoed in the quiet office. Your parents are your problem. Derek had looked me dead in the eye and refused to allocate a single dime to save my father's life. He had snapped his pristine briefcase shut and told me to handle my own family, while simultaneously stealing a fortune from my labor to ensure his parents never had to downgrade their country club memberships. My hands stopped shaking. The nausea evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity that settled deep in my chest. A weaker woman might have printed the spreadsheet, driven straight to his downtown office, and screamed until her vocal cords shredded. She might have thrown the papers in his face and demanded an immediate, dramatic divorce. But screaming surrenders the element of surprise. Confrontation gives the enemy time to prepare a defensive strategy. I was a supply chain director. I did not throw tantrums. I identified critical bottlenecks and I systematically eliminated them. Derek had laid out the exact terms of our marriage clearly in the kitchen. Your money is yours, my money is mine. He wanted strict financial boundaries. He wanted complete independence from my family. I looked at the glowing spreadsheet one last time before saving the file to a secure external drive. I decided right then I was going to give him exactly what he asked for. The Granite State Credit Union sat just off Elm Street, housed in a modest brick building that offered none of the sleek corporate intimidation of Derek's preferred Wall Street firms. I pulled my car into the icy parking lot during my lunch hour, the heater blasting warm air against my frozen fingers. Stepping inside the lobby felt like crossing a heavily fortified border. The air smelled of stale coffee and industrial carpet cleaner, a sharp contrast to the polished mahogany and leather environment my husband navigated every day. I approached the teller, a woman with kind, tired eyes, and asked to open a single individual checking account. Opening a new financial vessel requires precision. I handed over my identification, my corporate pay stubs, and my social security number. The process was swift and clinical. As the teller printed the final authorization forms, sliding them across the laminate counter, a heavy wave of memory washed over me. I picked up the blue ballpoint pen, hovering the ink above the signature line. My hand hesitated, but not from doubt. I was thinking about my father. Decades ago, in a loud, sprawling manufacturing plant on the edge of Manchester, Carlos Herrera worked consecutive overtime shifts until his body ached in ways he refused to verbalize. I remembered the distinct smell of ozone and machine oil that clung to his thick canvas jacket when he walked through our front door, long after the sun had set. His hands were perpetually calloused, the knuckles split from winter air and manual labor. Yet every Friday, he would sit at our scratched Formica kitchen table, carefully counting out a portion of his wages. He placed those crumpled bills into an old tin box. That tin box funded my entire first year of college. My father sacrificed his own physical comfort to ensure I could sit in a bright university lecture hall instead of a noisy factory floor. He never complained. He never demanded gratitude. He merely provided. The contrast made my stomach churn with a fierce protective heat. I thought about Gerald and Patricia sitting on the patio of their exclusive country club overlooking pristine, manicured golf greens. I remembered Patricia adjusting her cashmere sweater during our last Thanksgiving dinner, swirling a glass of imported Pinot Noir, while loudly complaining about the rising cost of gasoline affecting her lifestyle. They spent their days curating an aesthetic of unearned wealth while quietly draining the resources generated by my 60-hour work weeks. They were parasites, wrapped in designer labels, feeding off the labor of a daughter-in-law they treated with polite condescension. Derek had deemed my father unworthy of a single dime from our joint savings. My father, who literally broke his back to give me the education that secured my current six-figure salary. The sheer audacity of Derek funneling my paycheck to fund his parents' luxury vacations while letting my father drown in medical debt crystallized my resolve. I pressed the pen to the paper and signed my name. Just like that, the financial artery was severed. The teller smiled and handed me my new routing digits. I sat in my car and opened my corporate payroll portal on my phone. With a few swift keystrokes, I deleted the joint account information and inputted the new credit union numbers. Every cent of my future earnings would now drop into a vault only I possessed the key to open. My next maneuver required a different type of access. I logged into our primary household portal one final time. I located the automated recurring transfer, the one deceptively labeled Vanguard Tech ETF, and hit cancel. The digital prompt asked if I was sure I wanted to terminate this scheduled transaction. I tapped confirm. The route vanished. The supply chain feeding Gerald and Patricia collapsed into the ether. Before logging out, I executed one last transfer. I moved exactly $18,400 from the joint savings directly to the Regional Cardiology Center to clear my father's medical debt. Derek had told me to handle my own family. I was simply following his directives. Since my income had artificially inflated that savings pool for 6 years, taking back my father's medical costs was not theft. It was a meager refund on a much larger embezzlement. I spent the rest of the afternoon at the office reviewing freight manifests and international shipping schedules. My colleagues noticed nothing unusual. My demeanor remained professional, measured, and calm. But beneath the surface, my pulse thumped with a steady, rhythmic anticipation. When I pulled into our driveway that evening, the house glowed with warm, inviting light. I walked through the front door, slipped off my wool coat, and headed straight for the kitchen. I began preparing dinner, chopping fresh vegetables and searing chicken with a practiced domestic rhythm. The aroma of garlic and rosemary filled the room, creating the perfect illusion of a happy, tranquil marriage. Derek arrived 30 minutes later. The garage door rumbled, shutting out the harsh New Hampshire cold. He stepped into the kitchen, dropping his keys on the entry table. He loosened his silk tie, rolling his shoulders to release the tension of his workday. He looked at me standing by the stove and offered a smooth, practiced smile. "Smells great," he said, leaning against the marble island. I turned the heat down on the burner and wiped my hands on a towel. "How was the market today?" I asked, keeping my voice light and conversational. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Volatile. Had to talk a few clients off a ledge. People panic when they do not understand the long game." I offered a sympathetic nod. "You always know how to manage the risk, Derek." He chuckled, a sound dripping with unearned superiority. "That is the job, Justine. You have to keep the emotions out of the math. Speaking of which, I hope you understand why I drew a hard line this morning. We cannot let family emergencies derail our portfolio. We are building wealth here. It requires discipline." I picked up a wooden spoon and stirred the simmering pan. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact. "I understand perfectly," I replied. "Your money is yours. My money is mine. You are right to establish clear financial boundaries. I handled my father's situation on my own today. It will not be an issue moving forward." Derek beamed. A genuine look of relief and pride washed over his face. He believed he had won. He believed he had successfully trained his high-earning wife to accept his financial dominance without a fight. He thought his hidden pipeline to Gerald and Patricia remained safe, secure, and invisible. "Good," he said, pouring himself a glass of water. "That is the smart way to operate. we protect our own assets. Dinner proceeded normally. We ate, we discussed trivial news, we cleaned the dishes together. If Derek possessed any intuition, he might have noticed the subtle shift in my posture. He might have sensed the cold vacuum where my affection used to reside. But Derek only saw what served him. He saw a compliant partner funding his opulent secret. Later that night, as Derek slept soundly beside me, I lay awake, staring at the shadows dancing across the bedroom ceiling. The digital clock on the nightstand clicked forward, marking the passage of time. In the logistics industry, we operate on rigid schedules. When a supply route is abruptly terminated, the downstream recipients do not feel the impact immediately. They continue operating, assuming the next shipment is already in transit. The shelves look full for a brief period, but eventually, the inventory runs out. The reality of the drought hits the loading dock. I had canceled the automated transfer on the 3rd of the month. Gerald and Patricia had already received their unearned salary for the current cycle. They would continue to swipe their premium cards, book their weekend getaways, and sip their expensive wines, oblivious to the severed artery. Derek would continue checking his joint portal, seeing his own paycheck land, but failing to realize my 6-figure deposit was missing until the end of the billing cycle approached. He was too arrogant to audit his own trap. The board was set. The pieces were locked in place. I closed my eyes and let the steady rhythm of my breathing lull me towards sleep. I had nothing left to do but wait. The 30-day countdown to the first missed payment had officially begun. The 30-day waiting period required a level of psychological endurance I did not know I possessed. February arrived in New Hampshire, bringing heavy snowfalls that buried the landscape in white, isolating our home in a quiet, frozen cocoon. Inside the house, the temperature remained perfectly regulated. I maintained the illusion of domestic tranquility with flawless precision. I cooked Derek his favorite meals. I asked about his clients. I smiled when he gave his pompous lectures on wealth accumulation. He walked around our home with the inflated chest of a conqueror, convinced he had successfully disciplined his high-earning wife into absolute financial submission. He never noticed the subtle shift in my logistics. He never realized I stopped bringing my corporate mail into the house, or that the digital notifications on my tablet were heavily encrypted. Arrogance creates a very specific type of blindness. Derek assumed the machinery of his life was running smoothly because he never bothered to look under the hood. He believed his automated world was indestructible. The first Friday of the new month arrived, carrying the distinct chill of an impending storm. The workday had ended, and we were settled in the living room. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting warm, golden shadows across the hardwood floor. I sat in my favorite armchair, holding a porcelain mug of chamomile tea, letting the steam rise against my face. Derek lounged on the leather sofa, his laptop resting on his knees, casually scrolling through a golf resort itinerary for the upcoming summer. Everything appeared picture perfect. Then his phone rang. The sharp digital chime shattered the quiet room. Derek glanced at the screen and let out a mild sigh of annoyance. It was his younger sister, Amanda. Before that evening, I had always viewed Amanda as a harmless nuisance. She was a woman, approaching 30, who still treated life like a prolonged college semester. She worked part-time at a boutique art gallery, a job that barely covered her extensive organic grocery habits, let alone her premium lifestyle. Yet she drove a brand new European luxury SUV, wore designer clothing, and treated my corporate career with a thin layer of wealthy disdain. She often made passive-aggressive comments about my long hours, suggesting I lacked a proper work-life balance, while she spent her Tuesdays at a high-end day spa. I had long wondered how a part-time gallery assistant afforded a vehicle that cost more than a standard mortgage down payment. Derek tapped the screen to answer, expecting a casual conversation about weekend plans. He put the phone to his ear, his eyes still focused on his laptop screen. "Hey, Mandy," he said, keeping his tone light. "What is going on?" The response was not a greeting. Even from 10 feet away, I could hear the shrill, frantic pitch of her voice leaking through the phone's receiver. The cadence was panicked, breathless, and entirely unhinged. I could not make out every single word, but the fragments that escaped were sharp enough to cut through the cozy atmosphere of the room. Declined. Insufficient funds. Mortifying. Derek sat up straight. The relaxed posture vanished, instantly replaced by rigid tension. He snapped his laptop shut, setting it aside with a heavy thud. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the device, pressing the speaker closer to his ear in a desperate attempt to muffle the sound. "Slow down," he commanded, his voice dropping an octave. "What do you mean it bounced?" Amanda shrieked something in response, a chaotic jumble of grievances. The words lease payment and collection agency drifted across the room. I kept my eyes fixed on the fireplace, taking a slow, deliberate sip of my tea. The hot liquid slid down my throat, warming my chest. The puzzle pieces rapidly assembled themselves in my mind, altering the entire landscape of my husband's betrayal. The $2,500 a month was not just funding Gerald and Patricia and their luxury European river cruises. It was the foundational pillar holding up the entire family facade. It was covering Amanda and her premium auto lease. It was paying for the day spa. My grueling supply chain logistics, my late nights negotiating shipping contracts, they were literally financing Amanda and her wealthy aesthetic. Derek was not just a dutiful son spoiling his parents. He was the central bank for an entire lineage of financial parasites, and he was using my blood to keep their accounts in the black. Derek shot a nervous glance in my direction. I offered him a blank, polite expression, holding my mug with relaxed fingers. He swallowed hard, a visible bob of his throat, and stood up from the sofa. "It is probably just a routing error," he told his sister, forcing a calming tone he clearly did not feel. "Let me step outside and check the portal. The banking app undergoes maintenance on the first of the month sometimes." He did not wait for her reply. He walked quickly across the living room, sliding the heavy glass patio door open and stepping out into the freezing New Hampshire night. He pulled the glass shut behind him, sealing himself on the back porch. The temperature outside was hovering in the single digits. He wore nothing but a thin cotton sweater and slacks, but the cold did not seem to register. Panic generates its own heat. I shifted in my armchair, turning my body slightly so I had a clear view of the patio through the insulated glass. The outdoor security light cast a harsh white glow over his features, highlighting the deep lines of stress forming around his mouth. Derek paced the length of the wooden deck, his phone pressed tightly to his ear, trying to soothe Amanda, while his free hand patted his pockets in a nervous, frantic rhythm. I watched him pull the phone away from his face, ending the call. He stood still for a moment, breathing out a cloud of white vapor into the frigid air. Then his thumb began to move. He was opening the joint banking portal. The same portal I had audited 30 days prior. The same portal he believed was flush with my 6-figure corporate salary. In my line of work, you learn to appreciate the precise moment a system fails. You watch the exact second the supply chain snaps and the inventory screen flashes red. I sat in the warmth of my living room, a front-row spectator to my husband's financial collapse. Derek tapped the screen, navigating to the transfer menu. I knew exactly what he was attempting to do. He was trying to manually push the missing $2,500 to the external account to stop his sister's luxury car from being repossessed. He needed to cover the gap before his parents realized their golden child had dropped the ball. He pushed the button. The app processed the request. Even through the thick glass, I could see his reaction. His shoulders dropped. His head jolted back slightly as if the smartphone had physically shocked him. He tapped the screen again, harder this time, his thumb jabbing the glass. He refreshed the page. He swiped down. He tapped the primary account balance. The balance was virtually non-existent. Without my bi-weekly deposits, the account held nothing but his meager residual contributions, which were immediately devoured by our actual household mortgage and utility bills. There was no slush fund. There was no surplus. The well was entirely dry. Derek froze. The phone hung limply in his hand. He stared at the glowing screen for a long, agonizing minute, the freezing wind whipping his hair across his forehead. The realization washed over him, stripping away the arrogance, the superiority, the untouchable confidence he had paraded around the house for a month. He finally understood that the machinery was broken, and he had no tools to fix it. Slowly, he lifted his head. His gaze drifted from the screen of his phone through the patio door straight into the living room. His eyes locked onto mine. I did not look away. I did not pretend to be reading a book or watching the fire. I held his stare through the frost-covered glass. I lifted my porcelain mug to my lips and took another slow, measured sip of chamomile tea. My face betrayed zero emotion. I simply observed him standing in the freezing cold, locked out of the warmth, locked out of the wealth, locked out of the control he thought he possessed. The first domino had officially fallen, hitting the table with a deafening crash. The shockwave was already traveling through his family tree, fracturing the delicate, wealthy illusion they had built on my back. Derek grasped the patio door handle, his knuckles stark white against the dark metal. He was about to walk back into the house, demanding answers, demanding his power back. But he was about to learn a very hard lesson about supply and demand. When you cut off the supplier, you no longer dictate the terms of the negotiation. He pulled the door open, the freezing wind rushing into the living room. The illusion of our marriage was over, and the real war was walking right through the threshold. The heavy patio door slid open with a violent shudder, the metal track grinding in protest. Derek stepped back into the living room, bringing a rush of freezing New Hampshire air with him. His face was flushed a stark crimson that had nothing to do with the winter chill, and everything to do with the sudden, catastrophic failure of his financial ecosystem. He slammed the door shut, the glass rattling in its frame. For a man who prided himself on absolute control, his current state was a portrait of unraveling composure. He marched across the hardwood floor, stopping just short of the hearth. His shadow stretched long and jagged against the far wall, illuminated by the dancing flames. I remained seated in my armchair, the porcelain mug warming my palms. I did not shrink back. I did not prepare a defensive posture. I simply watched him, waiting for the inevitable explosion. "Where is it?" he demanded, his voice sharp and low, a forced whisper meant to convey menace. I took a slow sip of my tea. The chamomile tasted faint, overshadowed by the sharp, metallic tang of adrenaline pooling in my mouth. "Where is what, Derek? Do not play this game, Justine." His hands curled into tight fists at his sides. "The transfer did not go through. The joint portal is empty. Where is the deposit? Where is our money?" I set the mug down on the wooden side table, the ceramic bottom clicking softly against the grain. I looked at him, my expression devoid of the warmth he had come to expect over the last 6 years. "There is no our money, Derek," I replied, my tone steady and conversational. "Not anymore. I changed my direct deposits 30 days ago. Every cent of my income now resides in a private account located in a credit union you do not have access to. The Vanguard Tech ETF transfer has been permanently canceled." Derek stared at me, his jaw slack, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and growing terror. The pristine image of his high-earning, compliant wife was fracturing before his eyes, replaced by a woman who had quietly, surgically dismantled his entire operation. You canceled it. His voice cracked, losing its polished veneer. You cannot do that. We have obligations. Amanda is on the phone, screaming about a lease payment. My parents are depending on that capital. I leaned back in the chair, crossing one leg over the other. Obligations, I repeated, testing the word. That is an interesting choice of vocabulary, because I seem to recall a very different philosophy being preached in this exact house 30 days ago. I believe the exact phrasing was, your parents are your problem. Your money is yours. My money is mine. The words hit him like a physical blow. He blinked rapidly, his mind struggling to process the sheer velocity of the turnabout. He had weaponized financial boundaries to avoid paying my father's medical debt, and I had simply adopted his policy with ruthless efficiency. That is different, he sputtered, taking a step closer. His imposing frame loomed over me, a classic intimidation tactic designed to force a retreat. I held my ground, keeping my gaze locked on his. My parents are retired, Justine. They rely on that surplus. Without it, they face severe consequences. You are acting entirely out of spite. You are being selfish. Selfish. I laughed, a dry, humorless sound that echoed against the stone fireplace. I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and pulled out a neatly folded piece of paper. I had printed it at the office that afternoon. I unfolded the spreadsheet and dropped it onto the coffee table between us. Take a look at your surplus, Derek, I commanded. He hesitated, his eyes flicking down to the paper. The rows and columns were highlighted in stark yellow, illuminating 48 months of systematic theft. $120,000, I stated, spelling out the sum, so the magnitude of his deception filled the room. For 4 years, you skimmed my paycheck, disguised the theft as a legitimate technology sector investment, and funneled the cash to fund your family's luxury lifestyle. You paid for premium European cruises, tailored clothing, and premium auto leases while telling me we were building wealth. You treated my labor as a slush fund for your parents' unearned comfort. Derek stared at the spreadsheet, the evidence of his fraud laid bare. The initial shock began to morph into something uglier, something deeply ingrained in his psychology. He could not admit fault. He could not acknowledge the theft. He had to rewrite the narrative to maintain his delusion of superiority. I am the head of this household, he declared, his voice rising in volume. I manage the portfolio. I make the strategic allocations to ensure long-term stability. Funding Amanda's day spa visits is not a strategic allocation, Derek I countered, slicing through his rhetoric. It is embezzlement. I was protecting our assets, he yelled, pacing the length of the rug, his chest heaving. You travel constantly. You are consumed by supply chain logistics. I handled the domestic economics. I made executive decisions. The ETF label was just a placeholder, a temporary categorization until I rebalanced the portfolio. You are blowing this completely out of proportion. The gaslighting was almost impressive in its audacity. He was staring at a documented trail of theft and attempting to convince me it was a sophisticated investment strategy. You sat in the kitchen 30 days ago and refused to help my father pay an $18,000 medical bill, I said, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet register. A bill incurred because a man broke his body working in a factory, so I could sit in a university classroom. You looked at a life-saving procedure and called it a burden. You told me to fend for myself. I leaned forward, picking up my tea. Well, Derek, I fended for myself. The financial artery is severed. I will not reinstate the transfers. I will not fund your parents' country club membership. I will not pay for Amanda's car. You drew the battle lines. I am merely occupying the territory you established. Derek stopped pacing. The silence in the living room grew heavy, suffocating. He realized the tactics were failing. The intimidation, the gaslighting, the appeals to his fictitious authority, none of it was working. The compliant wife was gone. The hostile asset had arrived. "You are going to destroy this family," he whispered, his eyes dark with frantic desperation. "I did not destroy anything," I replied. "I simply stopped paying the ransom." He stared at me for one long, agonizing moment, realizing he possessed absolutely zero leverage. Without my income, his parents' opulent lifestyle was a sinking ship, and he was the captain, holding a bucket full of holes. He spun around, grabbing his winter coat from the armchair. He did not bother putting it on. He stormed toward the front door, his heavy footsteps thudding against the wood. The door wrenched open, the freezing wind howling through the entryway. He slammed it shut behind him, the entire house vibrating from the force. The sound of his tires screeching out of the driveway followed a chaotic retreat into the dark New Hampshire night. I sat in the quiet living room, watching the flames dance in the hearth. The first skirmish was over, and I had held the line. But as I picked up the spreadsheet from the coffee table, a distinct vibration buzzed against my thigh. I pulled my phone from my pocket. It was an automated alert from a premium credit monitoring service. The notification glowed brightly against the dark screen. A new high-tier hard inquiry had just been placed on my Social Security number, originating from a local mortgage lending institution. The chill returned, settling deep in my chest. Derek was not just retreating. He was panicking. And panic drives desperate men to cross boundaries far more dangerous than simple domestic theft. The skirmish was over, but the war was about to escalate into a territory I had never anticipated. The living room settled into a heavy quiet after the front door slammed shut. The fire in the hearth burned down to glowing orange embers, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. I remained in my armchair, staring at the glowing notification on my phone screen. The alert flashed a red banner across the lock screen, indicating a Tier 1 hard credit inquiry. People trigger these specific alerts when they buy vehicles or open high-limit credit lines. I tapped the banner, letting the facial recognition unlock the device. The application took a long moment to load the secure dashboard. My credit score sat untouched near the 800 mark, but a new entry rested under the Recent Activity tab. The originating institution was Granite Peak Lending. They were a regional bank known for handling high-net-worth real estate transactions across New England. I did not call Derek to ask him about it. Calling a liar only yields more lies. I carried my phone into the home office and opened my laptop. The room felt colder than the rest of the house. I sat in his leather chair and navigated to the Granite Peak website. They operated a localized digital portal for applicants. I used my Social Security number and basic identity verification to initiate a loan status check, pretending I was simply retrieving my own files. The system prompted me for a security PIN. Derek lacked imagination. He used the same 6-digit code for everything, which was our anniversary date, combined with his birth year. I typed the numbers. The dashboard unlocked, granting me full access to the pending file. The screen populated with a property address situated in Lincoln, New Hampshire, right in the heart of the White Mountains. It was a region known for sprawling luxury cabins, private ski access, and exorbitant property taxes. Gerald and Patricia had rented a chalet up there 2 winters ago. I remembered sitting at a family dinner listening to them complain the entire time that they did not own the deed. They felt entitled to a permanent view of the snow-capped peaks. The requested loan amount sat bolded at the top of the page, $600,000. Derek was attempting to purchase a retirement retreat for his parents using my pristine credit profile as the primary collateral. In the logistics industry, you learn that moving high-value freight requires verifiable documentation. Real estate transactions operate on the same principle. You cannot simply type a spouse's name into a web browser and secure a $500,000 mortgage. Lenders demand physical presence or legal proxies to bind a secondary party to a debt. I navigated to the document repository on the lending dashboard. A folder labeled Borrower Authorizations contained 3 PDF files. I downloaded the most recent upload and opened it on my screen. The document was a specific power of attorney. The text granted Derek full legal authority to execute real estate contracts on my behalf. I scrolled down to the justification clause. The typed paragraph claimed I was a global supply chain director whose frequent international travel rendered me unavailable for the standard closing process. The logic was chillingly plausible. I did travel frequently. I did manage global freight. He weaponized my professional dedication to bypass the bank security protocols. At the bottom of the final page rested a signature that looked remarkably similar to my own, alongside a digital notary stamp dated 3 days prior. A cold wave washed over me, starting at the base of my neck and radiating down to my fingertips. This was no longer a domestic dispute over marital boundaries. This was not a disagreement about family allowances or financial independence. Derek had crossed a permanent legal line. Forging a legal proxy to secure a $600,000 loan constituted identity theft. Submitting those fabricated documents across state lines via a digital portal constituted felony wire fraud. My husband was not just a selfish man throwing a tantrum because his slush fund dried up. He was a financial predator. Predators rely on their targets remaining passive. They depend on the shock of the betrayal to paralyze the victim. But my entire career revolved around mitigating disaster and isolating contaminated supply lines. I did not feel paralyzed. I felt a sharp, surgical focus take over my mind. I looked at the digital clock on the desk. It was late, but banks operating at this tier maintained continuous fraud departments to protect their own assets. I dialed the toll-free number listed on the Granite Peak portal. The automated system routed me through a series of prompts before a human representative answered. Her voice sounded tired but professional, a standard late-night customer service tone. I gave her my name and social security number. I requested an immediate hold on the pending application for the Lincoln property. She asked for my security PIN. I provided it. Then, I delivered the final blow. I informed her that the power of attorney submitted under my name was a forgery. I told her I had never seen the document, never signed it, and never authorized my husband to purchase real estate on my behalf. I added that I was placing a hard lock on my credit profile across all 3 major bureaus immediately following this call. The representative shifted her tone instantly. The procedural fatigue vanished, replaced by sharp corporate urgency. Banks do not take mortgage fraud lightly. She typed rapidly on her keyboard, the clicking echoing through the phone line. She confirmed the application was now frozen and flagged for an internal fraud review. She advised me to file a police report to document the identity theft. I thanked her and ended the call. The Lincoln Chalet was dead. Derek's attempt to pivot his financial scheme and secure a backup asset for his parents had failed before it even left the ground. He would receive a notification from the bank soon, likely an automated email rejecting the application due to suspected fraud. But the freeze was merely a defensive maneuver. Shielding my credit did not neutralize the threat sleeping under the same roof. If Derek was willing to commit a federal crime to secure a vacation home for his parents, there was no limit to the damage he might inflict when he realized I had blocked this path as well. He was desperate, and desperate men make unpredictable choices. I needed more than a locked bank account. I needed an architect to help me tear his foundation down to the studs. I needed someone who understood the legal architecture of divorce and fraud. I closed the laptop. The glow from the screen faded, leaving the office in quiet darkness. Tomorrow morning, I would not go to the supply chain logistics center. I would drive south to Concord. It was time to find a lawyer who understood how to wage a war. Interstate 93 stretched south toward Concord, a ribbon of gray asphalt cutting through the dense pine forests of central New Hampshire. The heater in my car hummed a steady rhythm, fighting back the single-digit temperatures pressing against the glass. I kept the radio off. The silence allowed me to construct the architecture of my defense. My destination was a nondescript brick building sitting 2 blocks from the state capitol. It lacked the flashy glass facades favored by corporate downtown firms, but the brass plaque beside the heavy oak door carried a reputation that commanded respect. Valerie Sterling, Family Law and Financial Litigation. Valerie did not offer a warm, comforting smile when I walked into her office. She stood behind a sprawling glass desk, wearing a tailored charcoal blazer, her dark hair pinned back in a severe, practical knot. Her eyes, dark and assessing, scanned me, as if calculating my exact risk tolerance before I even took a seat. The room smelled of bitter espresso and leather-bound legal volumes. It was a room designed for dismantling lives with surgical precision. I liked her immediately. I opened my leather tote and placed 2 distinct manila folders on the glass surface. I slid the first one across the table. "This is the baseline," I said, keeping my voice level. A spreadsheet detailing 48 months of missing income, $120,000 funneled from my direct deposits into an account labeled G&P expenses. My husband used it to fund his parents' lifestyle. Valerie opened the folder, adjusting her silver-framed reading glasses. She traced the printed lines with a manicured fingernail. Her expression remained neutral. "Spousal financial abuse," she noted, her tone dry. "A classic diversion of marital assets. Painful, but legally common. We can easily force restitution during the division of property by attacking his retirement accounts." I rested my hand on the second folder. "That is the common part," I replied. "This is the part that crosses state lines." I pushed the second file forward. It contained the printed screenshots from the Granite Peak lending portal, along with the forged specific power of attorney and the fake digital notary stamp. Valerie opened it. The quiet in the office thickened. For 30 seconds, the only sound was the rustle of paper as she flipped between the pages, examining the signature lines and the loan origination details. When she finally looked up, the detached family lawyer was gone. In her place sat a financial fraud litigator, staring at a winning hand. "Your husband is not a very smart criminal, Justine." Valerie tapped the forged document with her pen. "This is not just marital asset diversion. Submitting a fraudulent legal proxy to secure a $600,000 loan via an online banking portal constitutes felony wire fraud. He essentially handed you a loaded weapon." We discussed the landscape of the impending war. Valerie explained how family court operates on a civil level, prioritizing equitable distribution. But the moment federal offenses enter the equation, the leverage shifts entirely. Derek faced potential prison time. We could use that shadow hanging over his head to dictate every single term of the divorce. He would concede the house, the retirement accounts, and the savings simply to keep me from handing this file directly to the district attorney. But Valerie caught something I had missed in my initial audit. She tapped the first spreadsheet again, analyzing the withdrawal dates. $2,500 a month is a highly specific number, she murmured, leaning back in her leather chair. "You mentioned his parents use it for luxury car leases and vacations. But look at the routing rhythm on these dates. The withdrawals out of his parents' destination account are too erratic for standard auto payments. Some months the money sits there untouched. Other months it vanishes the exact same day it arrives." I frowned, leaning forward to study the page. What does that imply? It implies his parents might not be the final destination, Valerie said. Or at least, not the only destination. When amateurs steal money, they rarely stop at a single layer of deception. They build labyrinths to confuse themselves as much as anyone else. I am bringing in an independent forensic accountant. We need to look beneath the floorboards of the G&P account. I want to know where every single cent terminated. The strategy sounded bulletproof, but the execution carried a heavy psychological cost. Valerie folded her hands on the desk and delivered my marching orders. The forensic trace will take a few days, she explained. Until we have the full financial autopsy, you cannot tip your hand. He knows you stopped his slush fund. He knows you locked him out of your income. Let him panic about that. But he cannot know you discovered the Granite Peak mortgage or the forged documents. I nodded, slowly understanding the tactical requirement. If he thinks he is facing a standard divorce, he will act arrogant, Valerie continued. If he realizes he is facing a federal indictment, he might try to destroy evidence or liquidate his remaining assets and run. You have to go back to that house, Justine. You have to sleep under the same roof as a man who stole your identity. You must maintain the status quo. How do I do that? I asked. You play the cold, detached wife. You use a method called gray rocking. When he yells, you offer no emotion. When he begs, you offer zero sympathy. Let him rage about the missed car payments. Give him enough rope to believe he still holds some control over the narrative. Can you do that? I thought about the sheer audacity of Derek's actions. I thought about him pacing in the freezing cold, desperately trying to push my paycheck to his sister. I thought about my father's medical bill resting in my pocket. The man who had dismissed my family was about to lose his own. I can do it, I replied. Leaving the office, I felt a distinct shift in my internal architecture. Driving north on the interstate, the winter sun began to set, casting long purple shadows across the snow-covered hills. The anxiety that had gripped my chest for the last 24 hours evaporated into the cold air. It was replaced by a rigid, tactical resolve. Derek thought he was playing a game of financial dominance. He did not realize I had just rewritten the rules of engagement. I gripped the leather steering wheel, the heater warming my hands. I was no longer a victim reacting to a betrayal. I was an active participant, setting a trap. As I pulled into my neighborhood, my phone buzzed in the center console. I checked the screen while idling at a stop sign. It was a text message from Derek. The tone was strangely subdued, a sharp departure from his aggressive exit the night before. He wrote that his parents wanted to host us for dinner this weekend at their rented lake house on Lake Sunapee. He called it a peace offering. He said they wanted to clear the air and find a reasonable compromise regarding our financial boundaries. A dark, cynical smile touched my lips. A peace offering from the people who had been quietly living off my labor for 4 years. They were not looking for a compromise. The missing money was hurting them, and they wanted to use their collective weight to force me back into submission. They were staging an ambush. And armed with the knowledge sitting in Valerie's office, I was more than ready to walk right into it. Lake Sunapee sat frozen under a thick layer of New Hampshire ice, the surrounding mountains casting long, jagged shadows across the white expanse. The rented lake house was a sprawling timber frame structure that looked less like a rustic cabin and more like a luxury resort designed specifically for wealthy weekenders. Warm yellow light spilled from the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the snow-covered deck. Derek drove us there in taut, uncomfortable silence, his hands gripping the steering wheel at precisely 10:02. He had spent the entire week playing the role of the contrite husband, attempting to mask his panic beneath a veneer of manufactured calm. He told me this dinner was a necessary step toward healing, a chance for his family to offer an olive branch, and discuss our financial boundaries like rational adults. I knew it was a lie the moment he suggested it. You do not invite your victim to an isolated location to apologize. You invite them there to execute an ambush. I stepped out of the car, the biting wind slicing through my wool coat. I followed Derek up the wooden steps, my boots crunching against the salt-treated ice. The heavy oak door swung open before he even knocked. Patricia stood in the entryway, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her shoulders draped in a heavy cashmere shawl. She offered a tight, practiced smile that failed to reach her eyes. "Justine," she murmured, leaning in for an air kiss that left the scent of expensive floral perfume lingering in the cold air. "Come inside. You must be freezing." I stepped into the grand foyer. The house was excessively warm, smelling of roasted garlic and cedar smoke from the massive stone fireplace. Gerald sat in a leather armchair near the hearth, swirling a glass of amber liquid. Amanda perched on the edge of the velvet sofa, her arms crossed defensively over her chest. The tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to choke on. This was not a peace offering. This was a tribunal. We moved into the dining room, a long, rustic table set with fine china and polished silver. The catered meal, a sprawling display of roasted salmon, asparagus, and wild rice, sat untouched on the sideboard. Nobody made a move toward the food. The pretenses evaporated the moment I took my seat. Patricia took her place at the head of the table, folding her manicured hands elegantly over the linen tablecloth. She looked at me with an expression of profound disappointment, the kind usually reserved for a disobedient child. "Derek tells us there has been a misunderstanding regarding the family portfolio," she began, her voice smooth and deeply patronizing. "He says you have decided to isolate your income, Justine." I looked at Derek. He was staring intensely at his water glass, refusing to make eye contact. The cowardice was almost breathtaking. He had brought me here to face the firing squad because he lacked the courage to tell his parents the well had run dry. "It is not a misunderstanding, Patricia," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. "It is an audit." Gerald leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on the table. "An audit," he repeated, letting out a short, dismissive scoff. "You are a supply chain manager, Justine, not a forensic accountant. Derek is a financial professional. He has managed this family's wealth brilliantly for years. He maximizes our returns. He ensures our stability. Your sudden decision to hoard your salary is creating unnecessary friction." The dramatic irony sitting in that dining room was almost physical. I listened to Gerald praise his son's financial brilliance, fully aware that Derek was currently facing a potential federal indictment for wire fraud. I listened to them defend the stability of their portfolio, knowing their son had secretly siphoned over $100,000 of my money just to keep their luxury lifestyle afloat. I looked at Amanda, who was practically vibrating with righteous indignation. "I had to cancel my salon appointments," she snapped, leaning across the table. "My auto lease payment was returned. Do you have any idea how embarrassing that is, Justine? Derek had to spend hours on the phone with the bank sorting out your little tantrum. I am so sorry you experienced a brief interruption in your day spa schedule." "Amanda," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet register. "But my salary is not an allowance for your leisure activities." Patricia gasped, pressing a hand dramatically to her chest. "How dare you speak to her that way? You are financially abusing my son. You are holding your income hostage to punish us because Derek rightly refused to pay for your father's medical mistakes." The audacity was staggering. They had convinced themselves that my money belonged to them by default. They believed my labor existed solely to fund their comfort, and any attempt to keep my own earnings was an act of violence against their family. "We have pristine credit," Justine Patricia continued, her tone hardening into a demand. We have immaculate financial standing. Derek has built a robust investment strategy for us. We do not need your money to survive. But your sudden withdrawal is disrupting the cash flow he meticulously designed. You need to reinstate the direct deposits immediately. I felt a dark, cynical smile touch the corners of my mouth. I thought about the forged power of attorney sitting in Valerie Sterling's office. I thought about the $600,000 mortgage Derek had tried to secure under my name because his parents' pristine credit was, apparently, not enough to buy this very lake house. If your credit is so pristine, Patricia, I asked, leaning forward, resting my arms on the table. And if Derek's portfolio management is so brilliant, why do 3 able-bodied adults require a $2,500 monthly subsidy from their daughter-in-law just to keep the lights on? The dining room plunged into an absolute suffocating silence. The words hung in the air, slicing through the manufactured illusion of their wealth. Gerald froze his glass halfway to his mouth. Amanda's jaw dropped open, a look of genuine shock washing over her features. Patricia stared at me, her eyes wide, the manicured composure shattering into a million jagged pieces. They did not know. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. Derek had not just lied to me. He had lied to them. He had never told his parents that the monthly deposits funding their luxury lifestyle came directly from my paycheck. He had sold them a narrative of his own financial genius, claiming the money was the result of his brilliant market investments. He had stolen my income and presented it to his family as proof of his own success. I turned my head slowly, looking directly at my husband. He was completely pale. His chest heaved as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. The trap he built had finally snapped shut, catching his own neck in the mechanism. "Where did you think the money was coming from?" I asked, addressing the silent room, but keeping my eyes locked on Derek. "Did he tell you it was dividends? Did he tell you he was beating the market? Because the truth is a lot less glamorous. The truth is, your son has been quietly embezzling my salary for 48 months to pay for your vacations." Derek bolted upright, his chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. "Shut up," he hissed, his voice cracking with panic. I did not move. "I am simply answering their questions, Derek. They wanted to know why I isolated my income. I am providing the ledger." He lunged forward, grabbing my upper arm with a bruising grip. "We are leaving," he commanded, hauling me out of my chair. I did not fight him. I let him drag me toward the foyer, pulling my coat off the brass hook. The silence in the dining room behind us was deafening. No one spoke. No one moved to intervene. The illusion was dead, and the corpse was rotting right on their expensive linen tablecloth. Derek shoved the front door open, pulling me out into the freezing night air. He practically threw me toward the passenger side of the car, his breathing ragged, his eyes wild with desperation. He knew the ambush had failed completely. He knew his parents would start asking questions he could not answer. But as I slid into the cold leather seat, listening to the engine roar to life, I knew the truth was far more devastating than a simple stolen allowance. Valerie Sterling was running a forensic trace on the GMP account, and if Derek was desperate enough to lie to his own parents about the source of the money, I knew he was hiding something much darker beneath the surface. The real storm had not even made landfall yet. The drive back from Lake Sunapee passed in a suffocating silence. The dark New Hampshire pines blurred past the passenger window, a continuous wall of black timber against the frozen night sky. Derek kept both hands locked onto the steering wheel. His breathing was shallow and fast, the rhythm of a man whose carefully constructed reality had just shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces. He had intended to use his parents to bully me into submission. Instead, I had handed them the magnifying glass and pointed it directly at his deception. When we finally pulled into our driveway in Manchester, he killed the engine but made no move to exit the vehicle. He just sat there, staring through the frosted windshield. I did not wait for him. I unbuckled my seatbelt, stepped out into the freezing air, and walked inside. I hung my wool coat in the hallway closet. The house was quiet, smelling faintly of the vanilla candles I had burned the night before. I walked into the kitchen and retrieved a glass from the cabinet, filling it with cold tap water. I took a slow, measured sip, letting the chill slide down my throat. The heavy door from the garage opened. Derek stepped inside. The shock that had paralyzed him at the lake house was gone. In its place was a frantic, venomous energy. He shed his jacket, dropping it onto the floor. "You think you are untouchable," he said, his voice a low, rough rasp. He stepped toward the marble island, leaning his weight onto the counter. "You think because you hold a corporate title and a 6-figure salary, you dictate the terms of this marriage." I did not respond. I leaned against the opposite counter, holding my glass of water, maintaining a neutral expression. Valerie Sterling had given me a specific protocol for this exact phase. She called it gray rocking. You become the most uninteresting, unreactive object in the room. You offer zero emotional feedback. Narcissists and manipulators feed on conflict. They want you to scream back. They want you to defend yourself because defense implies they hold enough authority to judge you. When you offer nothing, they starve. "I am going to make a phone call tomorrow morning," Derek continued, his tone darkening, taking a step closer. "I know the regional vice president at your medical tech firm. We played golf last summer. I am going to tell him my wife is suffering a severe mental breakdown. I will tell him you are erratic, hoarding assets, and exhibiting paranoid behavior. How long do you think they will let you manage global supply chains when your own husband warns them you are a liability?" It was a calculated threat, designed to strike at the core of my independence. My career was the engine of my freedom. He wanted to paralyze me with the fear of professional ruin. I looked at him, blinking slowly. I took another sip of water. "Okay, Derek," I said. My voice carried the same flat inflection I used when confirming a delayed freight manifest. His jaw tightened. The lack of fear confused him. He expected tears. He expected me to beg him not to ruin my reputation. "I will do it!" He pushed, his voice rising in volume. "I will tear your professional life apart. You will be blacklisted in this state. If you feel that is the best use of your time, you should do it," I replied, setting the glass down. I turned toward the hallway. "Good night, Derek." He moved faster than I anticipated, cutting across the kitchen to block the doorway. His imposing frame filled the space. The anger in his eyes suddenly flickered, morphing into something entirely different. The rigid posture collapsed, his shoulders slumped, and the venomous predator vanished, replaced by a terrified, desperate boy. He sank to his knees, right there on the kitchen tiles. "Justine, please," he whispered, staring up at me. His eyes pooled with tears, real tears, born of authentic terror. "Do not do this. My mother is going to call me tomorrow morning. She is going to demand to see the portfolio ledgers. She is going to ask why her son has been lying to her. I have nothing to show her." He reached out, grabbing the hem of my cardigan. His hands were shaking. "I will pay it back," he sobbed, the tears spilling over his cheeks. "I swear to you, I will restructure the accounts. I will figure out a repayment plan. Just authorize a bridge loan. Just give me one single transfer to cover the gap until I can fix this. If you do not help me, they will lose their house. My father will disown me. Please, Justine, I am begging you. I stared down at the man kneeling on the floor. For 6 years, I had believed he was a pillar of stability. Now he was weeping on the tile, begging me to fund a lie he lacked the courage to confess. A tiny part of my history, the part that had loved him, urged me to reach down and comfort him. But the supply chain director saw only a critical failure. You do not pour clean resources into a contaminated vessel. I reached down and gently pried his fingers off my cardigan. Your parents are your problem, I said, quoting the very rule he established. I stepped around him, walking up the stairs to the guest bedroom. I went inside, closed the door, and turned the deadbolt. I lay awake for a long time, listening to the muffled sounds of his panic echoing from the kitchen below. The morning arrived carrying a brutal wind chill that rattled the window panes. I dressed for work, selecting a sharp, tailored suit in armor of wool and silk. I gathered my briefcase and walked downstairs. The house was dead quiet. Derek was nowhere to be seen. I assumed he had exhausted himself and fallen asleep on the living room sofa. I stepped out the front door, locking it behind me. My car sat in the driveway, a light dusting of fresh snow coating the windshield. I unlocked the vehicle, pulling the door open. Derek stepped out from behind the trunk. He looked terrible. His clothes were rumpled, his eyes bloodshot and rimmed with dark purple shadows. He had not slept. He had spent the entire night pacing, stewing in the reality of his impending ruin. He walked to the back of my car, planting his feet firmly on the frozen asphalt directly behind my rear bumper. You are not leaving, he said, his voice flat and dead. I stood by the open driver's side door, resting my briefcase on the driver's seat. Derek, move out of the way. I have a logistics meeting at 9. You are going to log into your new credit union account on your phone, he instructed, pointing a trembling finger at me. You are going to initiate a wire transfer for $10,000 to my personal checking account. Then you can go to your meeting. He was attempting to hold my morning hostage. He believed the threat of public embarrassment, the fear of a domestic scene in our quiet, respectable neighborhood, would force me to capitulate. He was betting my desire to avoid a scene outweighed my resolve. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I reached into my coat pocket and retrieved my smartphone. I kept my eyes locked on his as I bypassed the lock screen and opened the keypad. I pressed 9. I pressed 1. I pressed 1 again. I hit the green call button and tapped the speaker icon, holding the phone up in the freezing air. The dial tone rang once. A sharp, professional voice answered. 911, what is your emergency? Derek froze. The color drained entirely from his face, turning his skin an ashen gray. Hello, I said, my voice calm and clear, carrying across the icy driveway. I need a patrol unit dispatched to my residence. My estranged husband is currently attempting to physically barricade my vehicle to extort money. Derek stumbled backward off the driveway, his boots slipping on a patch of ice. He nearly fell, scrambling onto the snow-covered lawn. The respectable finance manager vanished entirely, replaced by a man terrified of the legal consequences of his own desperation. Police sirens meant documentation. Documentation meant the illusion of his perfect life would be officially destroyed in the public record. He held his hands up in surrender, backing rapidly toward the front door. I am moving, he stammered, his voice cracking. I am moving. Do not tell them to come. The operator spoke again, asking for my address. Cancel the request, I told the operator, stepping into my car. The individual has retreated from the vehicle. I am safe and leaving the premises now. I ended the call and pulled the door shut. I started the engine, the heater roaring to life. I shifted into reverse, checking my rearview mirror. Derek was standing on the front porch, shivering in the cold, watching his final attempt at control roll smoothly out of the driveway. The drive to the medical tech firm allowed my heart rate to normalize. The confrontation in the driveway confirmed everything Valerie Sterling had warned me about. Derek was dangerous because he had nothing left to lose. He was operating purely on panic. I pulled into the corporate parking lot, flashed my badge at security, and rode the elevator up to the executive suite. I greeted my administrative assistant, hung my coat on the door hook, and sat down at my desk overlooking the city of Manchester. The morning sun reflected off the glass towers, offering a brief moment of quiet focus. My desk phone chimed. My assistant spoke over the intercom. "Justine, a private courier just dropped off a package for you. It requires a direct signature. Send them in," I replied. A moment later, a uniformed courier entered my office, holding an electronic clipboard and a thick, sealed manila envelope. I signed the digital screen. The courier handed me the package and departed, pulling the glass door shut behind him. I looked down at the envelope resting on my desk. The return address, printed in crisp black ink, belonged to the independent forensic accountant Valerie Sterling had hired. The financial autopsy was complete. I reached for a brass letter opener, sliding the sharp metal edge under the adhesive flap. The envelope split open. I pulled out a thick stack of bound documents, printed spreadsheets, banking ledgers, and corporate filings. The secrets Derek had buried beneath his parents' lifestyle were sitting right in my hands. I turned to the executive summary on the first page, preparing to read the actual truth behind the stolen wealth. The brass letter opener sliced through the thick adhesive flap of the manila envelope with a satisfyingly sharp sound. I pulled the dense stack of documents out, letting the heavy paper land with a thud on my glass desk. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed, casting a sterile glow across the first page. It was an executive summary, prepared by the forensic accountant Valerie Sterling had retained. The header read, "Financial Autopsy, G&P Expenses." I took a deep breath, centering myself. I was prepared to see the evidence of Derek funding his parents' lavish lifestyle. I was prepared to see the receipts for European cruises, imported cars, and expensive day spas. I was not prepared for what the actual numbers revealed. I turned past the title page. The first spreadsheet detailed the initial routing of the $2,500 that left my paycheck every month. The money landed exactly where I suspected, in the regional credit union account belonging to Gerald and Patricia. But the second spreadsheet tracked where the money went next. It did not stay in their account. It barely paused there. Within 48 hours of my deposit hitting their ledger, the funds were systematically transferred out via automated clearinghouse payments. The destination was not a travel agency. It was not a luxury auto dealership. The money flowed directly into a corporate shell entity registered in the state of Delaware. The company was named G&P Holdings Limited Liability Corporation. I frowned, leaning closer to the paper, tracing the lines with my index finger. I had assumed Derek was using the money to pay for his parents' direct expenses, but this structure indicated something far more complex. He was washing the money through their personal account to create a layer of plausible deniability before moving it into a corporate vessel. I turned to the next section, which contained the corporate registration documents for the LLC. The named principal, the sole managing member listed on the state filings, was Patricia. My stomach tightened. Patricia was an incredibly arrogant woman who loved the aesthetic of wealth, but she possessed zero actual business acumen. She spent her days attending charity luncheons and complaining about the cost of organic produce. There was absolutely no logical reason she would operate a complex holding company out of Delaware. She did not know. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Derek had not just lied to me. He had weaponized his own mother, He had forged Patricia's signature to establish a phantom corporation, making her legally responsible for the entity without her knowledge or consent. He was using her identity as a shield. But a shield against what? I flipped to the final section of the report. The pages were dense, containing hundreds of microtransactions originating from the LLC. The forensic accountant had managed to pierce the corporate veil, tracing the outbound capital. The money was not being spent on goods or services. It was being wired offshore to a series of sophisticated gambling syndicates. Derek was a sports bettor. The image of him standing in my kitchen, staring obsessively at his smartphone, suddenly crystallized in my mind. He had not been checking client emails. He had been monitoring live spreads, sweating over games he had staked a fortune on. But the deeper I read, the more the truth twisted into something even darker. He was not just placing casual wagers on weekend football games. The ledgers detail the highly specific pattern of risky, short-term margin betting. He was shorting the market. And he was not shorting random sectors. He was betting aggressively against the medical technology industry, the very industry that employed me. The industry that generated the six-figure salary he was stealing. I sat back in my chair, the leather squeaking softly in the quiet office. The psychology of his actions was staggering in its malice. Derek worked in finance, but his career had plateaued years ago. He was a mid-level manager pushing mutual funds, while I was a global director navigating complex international supply chains. He felt inferior. His ego could not handle being out-earned by his wife. Instead of working harder, he had tried to prove his financial superiority by actively betting against the source of my success. He wanted my industry to fail so he could reap the windfall and finally feel like the dominant provider. But he was terrible at it. The ledgers painted a picture of catastrophic failure. The medical tech sector had boomed over the last 4 years. Every time my industry succeeded, Derek's margin calls triggered, forcing him to cover massive losses. He used my paycheck to service the debt, funneling the money through his parents' account and the Phantom LLC to hide the bleed. He was literally using my labor to fund his attempts to destroy the value of my labor. I turned to a specific page, highlighting a series of particularly brutal losses from earlier that winter. The date caught my eye immediately. It was the second week of January. It was the exact same week my father had his emergency cardiac procedure. My eyes scanned the column, landing on a single catastrophic transaction. Derek had placed a leveraged offshore bet against a major medical device manufacturer. The stock had rallied unexpectedly, resulting in a total margin liquidation. The amount he lost in that single afternoon was recorded in stark black ink. $18,400. The breath caught in my throat. I felt a sudden, icy chill spread through my chest. $18,400. It was the exact cost of my father's medical bill. I remembered standing in the kitchen holding the hospital statement. I remembered asking him to pull from our joint savings to help the man who had sacrificed his body to put me through college. I remembered Derek snapping his pristine briefcase shut and telling me to handle my own family because we needed to protect our assets. He had not refused to pay the bill because he believed in strict financial boundaries. He had refused because the money was already gone. He had lost the exact amount needed to save my father on a vindictive, reckless bet designed to stroke his fragile ego. He had prioritized his own gambling addiction over my father's life. The rage that ignited inside me was not hot or explosive. It was absolute zero. It froze every lingering shred of sympathy I might have held for the man I married. I was no longer dealing with a selfish husband or a financial parasite. I was dealing with a sociopath who viewed my family as collateral damage in his pathetic war for dominance. But the forensic report contained one final piece of devastating leverage. Derek had not just lost the money he stole from me. He had chased his losses, securing massive, high-interest commercial loans under the LLC to keep his gambling operation afloat. The debt attached to the Phantom Corporation totaled well over $300,000. And because Patricia was listed as the sole managing member of that LLC, she was legally liable for every single cent of that debt. Derek had not just bankrupted himself. He had built a financial bomb, strapped it directly to his own mother's chest, and hidden the detonator. I slowly gathered the documents, tapping the edges against the glass desk to align them perfectly. I slid the stack back into the manila envelope, sealing the flap. The war was no longer about marital assets or simple restitution. It was about total annihilation. My desk phone buzzed, shattering the silence in the office. I reached over, pressing the speaker button. Justine, my assistant, said, her voice tight with genuine alarm. I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's a woman on line 2. She says her name is Patricia and she's demanding to speak with you immediately. She sounds completely hysterical. I looked at the sealed envelope resting on my desk. The automated transfer had failed 30 days ago. The slush fund was dry, which meant Derek's creditors, the ones holding the commercial loans for the LLC, had finally stopped receiving their payments. They were no longer waiting for the money. They were coming to collect the collateral. Put her through, I said, my voice perfectly calm. The detonator had just been pressed. The red light on my desk phone blinked with a steady, urgent rhythm. My assistant had just informed me Patricia was on line 2, demanding an audience. I did not pick up the receiver. In my profession, you never engage an unpredictable vendor in a live negotiation when you can force them to leave a recorded paper trail. I pressed a single button, routing the incoming call directly to my encrypted digital voicemail. I sat back in my leather chair, watching the timer on the screen count the seconds of the recording. It ran for 3 full minutes. When the line finally disconnected, I clicked the audio file and let Patricia's voice fill the quiet space of my executive suite. The aristocratic veneer she wore so carefully at the lake house had vanished. She sounded breathless, her words stumbling over one another in a chaotic rush. Behind her frantic voice, I could hear the distinct industrial sounds of a diesel engine idling and the heavy clank of metal chains dragging across concrete. Justine, she gasped, the audio crackling with static. You have to stop this. You have to call them and fix this right now. There is a tow truck in my driveway. A man wearing a high-visibility vest just hooked up my SUV. He showed me a repossession order. He said the primary account is in default. I listened to the panic vibrating through the speaker. Patricia had curated her neighborhood aesthetic for decades. She lived in a manicured subdivision where the neighbors noticed every misplaced blade of grass. The sight of a repossession crew hauling away her imported vehicle in broad daylight was a social death sentence. But the vehicle was merely the opening act of the financial collapse. Patricia paused on the recording, taking a ragged breath. A new sound filtered through the background. It was Gerald, shouting, his voice echoing from what sounded like their front porch. He was arguing with someone. Then Patricia started crying. It was not a performative sniffle. It was a raw, guttural sound of pure terror. Another man just walked up the lawn, she sobbed, her voice dropping into a terrified whisper. He handed Gerald a stack of legal papers. Justine, they are suing us. The document says we owe $350,000. It names a company I have never heard of, but my name is printed on the top line as the managing director. They are threatening to seize the house. You have to wire the funds, Justine. Derek is not answering his phone. You have to reinstate the allowance. I know you are angry about the medical bill, but you cannot let them take our home. The message ended with a dial tone. I sat in the silence of my office, digesting the sheer, profound entitlement echoing in her final plea. She still believed my salary was her personal safety net. She remained entirely blind to the reality that her own golden child had forged her signature, constructed a phantom holding company, and tethered her to a staggering commercial loan to feed his gambling addiction. She thought my canceled allowance caused the lawsuit. She had no idea the allowance was the only thing paying the minimum interest on her son's hidden offshore debts. I exported the audio file, attaching it to a secure email addressed to Valerie Sterling. My subject line contained 3 words: "The trap closed." My cell phone rang less than 2 minutes later. Valerie did not waste time with pleasantries. I received the audio file. Valerie stated, her tone crisp and professional. The creditors moved faster than I anticipated. When Derek missed the initial commercial loan payment on the 1st of the month, they must have executed an acceleration clause. They pierced the corporate veil of the LLC and went straight for the listed guarantor. "What is our next move?" I asked, leaning forward and resting my elbows on the glass desk. "I am walking down the steps of the courthouse right now," Valerie replied. "I am filing the divorce petition, citing irreconcilable differences and egregious financial misconduct. I am simultaneously submitting the fraud injunctions attaching the forensic accounting report and the forged power of attorney documents. We are placing a hard legal freeze on all remaining marital assets. Derek will be served before sunset." I ended the call feeling a profound sense of equilibrium. The chaotic variables were finally locked into a rigid legal framework. I turned my attention back to my computer monitors, opening a global shipping manifest. I spent the next hour optimizing freight routes across the Pacific Ocean. The contrast was stark. I was managing millions of dollars in medical technology inventory, while my husband watched his entire fabricated reality burn to the ground. A sudden commotion outside my office doors shattered the quiet corporate atmosphere. I heard loud voices followed by the distinct sound of a physical scuffle. Heavy footsteps pounded against the carpeted hallway. I stood up from my desk, walking toward the glass walls of my suite. Derek was standing near the elevator banks. He had managed to bypass the ground floor lobby security, likely by tailgating a legitimate employee through the turnstiles. But the executive floor maintained a secondary security perimeter. 2 large men, wearing dark corporate blazers, had intercepted him. They held him firmly by the upper arms, preventing him from taking another step toward my door. He looked like a man who had survived a severe blunt force impact. The tailored wool suit he wore with such arrogance was wrinkled and stained. He had discarded his silk tie, leaving his collar unbuttoned and crooked. His hair stuck to his forehead in damp clumps. The polished finance manager was dead. Only the desperate gambler remained. "Justine!" he shouted, his voice echoing down the corridor. He struggled against the guards, planting his boots into the carpet. "Tell them to let me go! We have to talk!" I opened my office door and stepped out into the hallway. The administrative staff peered out from their cubicles, watching the scene unfold in stunned silence. I kept my posture straight, my expression devoid of any readable emotion. "Ma'am," one of the security guards asked, breathing heavily as he restrained Derek's right arm. "Do you know this individual?" I looked at the man who had stolen my income, mocked my father's health, and forged my identity. His eyes were wide, filled with a frantic, pleading energy. He knew his parents had been served. He knew the creditors had breached the gates. He had driven straight to my office, hoping to use his physical presence to force a negotiation. He still believed he could charm or intimidate his way out of the consequences. "Justine, please," Derek begged, his voice cracking. "My mother called me. The house, the loans, they are taking everything. You have to tell the bank you authorized the LLC. We can say it was a joint venture. If you do not claim the debt, they are going to send me to prison. I will do whatever you want. I will sign whatever you ask. Just give me 5 minutes inside your office." He was asking me to commit perjury. He wanted me to adopt his $350,000 gambling debt to save him from a federal indictment. I looked at the security guard. "He is a trespasser," I said, my voice carrying clearly down the hall. "I do not want him on this floor. Escort him out of the building. If he resists, call the local police department and press charges." Derek stopped struggling. The fight drained out of his body, leaving him limp in the guard's grip. He stared at me, the final realization sinking into his core. He was looking at a steel vault he could never pry open again. His leverage was gone. His secret was exposed. His family was ruined. The guards turned him around, marching him toward the service elevators. He did not look back. He kept his head bowed, staring at the floor as the heavy steel doors slid shut, hiding him from view. I walked back into my office and closed the glass door. The ambient hum of the corporate building returned. I picked up my pen and signed a pending freight contract. Derek was out of my building, but the legal machinery Valerie had activated was just winding up. The next time I saw my husband, he would not be standing in a hallway begging for a lifeline. He would be sitting in a sterile room, under oath, forced to answer for every single document he forged. The fluorescent lights in the conference room hummed that same low, steady note, bringing us right back to the exact moment this narrative began. I sat across the wide expanse of polished mahogany, watching the man who had tried to destroy my future. The digital clock on the wall shifted its numbers with a soft mechanical click, marking the start of the emergency deposition his defense attorney had so desperately requested. Derek walked into the room 10 minutes late. The transformation he had undergone since our driveway confrontation was stark. He did not look like a seasoned finance manager accustomed to commanding a boardroom. He looks like a man who had not slept in a week. His tailored suit hung loosely on his frame, the fabric wrinkled around the shoulders as if he had spent the night sleeping in his car. His silk tie was knotted hastily, resting slightly off-center. But the most telling detail was the object he carried in his right hand. For 6 years, Derek had treated his Italian leather briefcase like a sacred artifact. It was a physical symbol of his self-proclaimed financial superiority. Now the rich brown leather was scuffed along the bottom edges. A deep, jagged scratch marred the front flap, and the brass clasps looked dull. When he sat down next to his attorney, he placed the briefcase on the mahogany surface and attempted to open it to retrieve a pen. His hands shook. A fine, visible tremor rattled his fingers, making the brass clasps click a dozen times before they finally yielded. He was terrified. The bravado had vanished. Valerie sat beside me, radiating a cool, calculated energy. She wore a sharp navy blazer, her posture perfectly straight. She did not exchange pleasantries with opposing counsel. She did not offer a polite smile. She waited for the court reporter, a quiet woman sitting in the corner, to finish adjusting the stenograph machine before she even cleared her throat. "State your name for the record," Valerie instructed, her voice crisp and echoing in the quiet room. Derek cleared his throat. It sounded dry, like sandpaper scraping against rough wood. He stated his full name. The court reporter typed the letters in a rapid, rhythmic burst. Valerie established the baseline. She walked him through the standard preliminary questions, confirming he understood he was under oath and subject to the penalties of perjury. Derek nodded, his eyes darting toward the frosted glass exit door. He still believed this was a routine asset negotiation. He thought we were here to argue over the equity in our Manchester home and the balance of his remaining retirement accounts. He assumed the leverage rested on standard marital division formulas. He expected a negotiation. "Let us discuss your financial management during the marriage," Valerie said, opening her first manila folder. "You maintained sole control over the primary joint checking account, correct?" "Yes," Derek answered. his voice gaining a fraction of its old arrogance. I handled the domestic economics. I managed our portfolio to ensure stability. Valerie pulled a single sheet of paper from her file. It was the spreadsheet detailing the $2,500 monthly withdrawals. We have reviewed the outbound transfers categorized under the label Vanguard Tech ETF. Can you explain the nature of these transactions? Derek leaned back in his leather chair. He shot a quick side glance at his attorney, who offered a reassuring nod. Derek felt confident here. He had rehearsed this lie 100 times. He believed he could talk his way out of the theft by wrapping it in financial jargon. Those were strategic allocations, he replied, smoothing his crooked tie. I diverted surplus capital into a secondary holding account to maximize our interest yields. It was a standard diversification tactic to protect our liquid assets. And the destination account, labeled G&P expenses, Valerie pressed her tone, remaining entirely neutral. That account belongs to your parents, Gerald and Patricia. Why were marital funds deposited there? Derek swallowed hard but maintained his facade. The tremor in his hands briefly stopped. It was a family trust vehicle. My parents acted as custodians for a high-yield private investment pool. The money was always intended for our shared future. I was simply utilizing their pristine credit profile to secure better institutional rates. The court reporter captured every single word. The perjury was now officially entered into the legal record. Derek had just testified under oath that the stolen funds were part of a legitimate marital investment strategy. He dug the hole deeper and willingly handed Valerie the shovel. Valerie did not blink. She reached into her leather tote and withdrew a thick, bound stack of documents. She slid the first file across the polished mahogany. It moved with a soft swoosh, stopping precisely in front of Derek's defense attorney. I would like to enter Exhibit A into the record, Valerie said. This is a corporate registration filing from the state of Delaware establishing a limited liability company. The sole managing member is listed as Patricia. Derek stared at the paper. The last remaining trace of color drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. He looks like a man standing on the gallows, watching the lever drop. Can you confirm if this is the high-yield investment pool you just described? Valerie asked, her eyes locking onto his. Derek's attorney, a balding man in a gray suit, leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. He scanned the Delaware filing. He looked deeply confused. He had expected a fight over savings accounts, not corporate shell entities. He looked at Derek, waiting for an explanation that never came. Valerie did not wait for an answer. She slid the second document across the table, placing it right on top of the first. Exhibit B, she stated, her voice slicing through the heavy silence. A forensic accounting ledger tracing the exact routing of the funds deposited into that LLC. The capital did not remain in a trust vehicle. It was wired offshore to a series of sports betting syndicates. The ledger details extensive margin losses. The sound of the stenograph machine seemed deafening now. Derek's attorney stopped reading. He looked at his client, a sudden realization dawning on his features. He realized Derek had lied to him, too. Defense lawyers despise surprises, especially ones that involve documented wire fraud. My client reserves the right to review these documents before answering, the attorney interrupted, his voice tight with sudden alarm. He placed a hand over the paperwork. We have plenty of time for review, Valerie replied smoothly, sliding the third and final document forward. Exhibit C. A specific power of attorney submitted to Granite Peak Lending, attempting to secure a $600,000 mortgage. It bears my client's signature alongside a digital notary stamp. We have already confirmed with the notary that this stamp is a forgery. The room fell into a dead, suffocating quiet. The air conditioning vent hummed above us. Derek stared at the three documents resting in front of him. His hands dropped below the table, gripping his knees. He was breathing through his mouth, taking shallow, jagged gasps of air. The walls of the conference room were closing in rapidly. "Let us clarify your previous testimony," Valerie said, leaning forward, resting her arms on the table. "You stated under oath that the funds were a marital investment. If that is true, you utilized a phantom corporation to gamble away marital assets, effectively defrauding your wife." She paused, letting the weight of the accusation settle over him. She let the silence stretch for 5 agonizing seconds. However, Valerie continued, her voice dropping to a surgical whisper. "If you claim the funds belong to your parents as you initially told your wife, then you forged your own mother's signature to establish that LLC, saddling her with hundreds of thousands of dollars in commercial debt." The trap was flawless. The logic was inescapable. It was a perfect checkmate. Valerie folded her hands. "So which is it, Derek? Did you defraud your wife, or did you commit identity theft against your own mother? Keep in mind you have already sworn under oath that this was a marital trust." Derek's attorney stood up so fast his heavy leather chair slammed into the wall behind him. The loud impact echoed like a gunshot in the sterile room. "We need a recess," the attorney announced, his voice frantic. He was visibly sweating now. He looked at Valerie with a mixture of professional respect and deep, authentic terror. "We are pausing this deposition right now. I need to confer with my client in private." Valerie smiled, a cold, brilliant expression that conveyed total victory. "Take all the time you need, counsel." The attorney grabbed Derek by the shoulder, hauling him out of his chair. Derek moved like a sleepwalker. His eyes were wide, unblinking, staring at the forged power of attorney document left on the table. He stumbled toward the frosted glass door, his scuffed briefcase left abandoned beside his empty seat. I sat quietly watching the door swing shut behind them. The hostility, the arrogance, the entitled demands they had all evaporated into the sterile air. Derek was boxed into an impossible corner. If he admitted the truth about the marital theft, he faced severe civil penalties and total asset forfeiture. If he tried to protect the marital assets he confessed to forging, federal banking documents, and faced an imminent criminal indictment. He had built a labyrinth of lies to feed his own ego, and now he was trapped in the center, with no exit. The skirmish over my paycheck was ancient history. The war was over. All that remained was dictating the terms of his surrender. But before I could claim my final victory, his family, the very people who had ambushed me at the lake house, were about to discover exactly who they had been protecting. The morning after the deposition, my phone rang before sunrise. Valerie spoke with her usual crisp cadence. Patricia had been calling her firm non-stop since the courthouse opened. The older woman was demanding an emergency meeting to resolve the lawsuit threatening her estate. She still operated under the delusion that I was the architect of her misery. She believed sitting me down in a room with lawyers would intimidate me into releasing the frozen assets. I told Valerie I would attend on one non-negotiable condition. Derek had to be sitting at that table. The conference room at Valerie Sterling's office offered a sweeping view of downtown Concord, but nobody looked out the window. I sat next to Valerie, flanked by thick legal binders. The heavy oak door swung open, bringing the remnants of my husband's family into the space. The visual contrast between the people who ambushed me at the lake house and the trio standing before me was striking. Panic acts as a harsh solvent, washing away the polished veneer of unearned wealth. Patricia wore a wrinkled trench coat, her normally pristine silver hair frizzy at the edges. Her hands shook as she clutched a designer handbag that now represented a life she could no longer afford. Gerald walked with a sudden stoop, his shoulders sagging under the invisible weight of a 6-figure lawsuit. Amanda trailed behind them, chewing on her thumbnail, her eyes darting nervously around the imposing legal environment. A minute later, Derek walked in. He did not look at his parents. He did not look at his sister. He kept his gaze glued to the carpet, shuffling toward a chair at the far end of the long table, isolated from the rest of his bloodline. He moved like a prisoner walking toward a sentencing hearing. Patricia glared at me the moment she took her seat. She bypassed all pleasantries, leaning forward with a rigid posture. "You have made your point, Justine," Patricia stated, her voice trembling with indignation. "You have frozen the accounts and subjected us to profound humiliation." A tow truck arrived at our home. A process server terrified my husband. "We are facing a lawsuit from a commercial lender we have never done business with. You need to call your bank and untangle this administrative error immediately. If you reinstate the transfers, we are willing to overlook this entire episode." I did not respond. I simply looked at Valerie. The attorney opened a thick manila folder resting on the table. She extracted 3 specific documents and slid them across the polished wood, stopping directly in front of Patricia. "We are not here to negotiate a reinstatement of marital funds," Valerie said, her tone carrying the clinical detachment of a surgeon. "We are here to clarify liability. I suggest you read the top page." Patricia frowned, picking up the paper. It was the state filing for the Phantom Holding Company. Her eyes scanned the text, jumping from the corporate registry seals to the listed managing member. I watched her brow furrow in genuine confusion. "I do not understand," she murmured. "G&P Holdings. I never opened a corporation in Delaware. Why is my name on this charter?" "Turn to the second page," Valerie instructed. Patricia flipped the sheet. It was a copy of the commercial loan origination contract, the very document the creditors used to file their lawsuit. The signature line bore a flawless recreation of Patricia's cursive script. "That is my signature," Patricia whispered, her breathing turning shallow. "But I did not sign this. I have never seen this paper in my life." "Gerald, look at this." Gerald leaned over, adjusting his glasses. The color drained from his weathered face. He looked up, staring directly at his son sitting at the far end of the table. Valerie delivered the translation. "Your son forged your signature, Patricia. He established a limited liability company using your identity to secure exorbitant commercial loans. He funneled the borrowed capital into offshore sports betting syndicates. The ledger underneath that contract details his margin calls. He was engaged in high-risk gambling, losing hundreds of thousands of dollars. The monthly allowance you received from his wife was merely a fraction of the stolen money used to pay the minimum interest on his hidden debts to keep the creditors at bay. When Justine severed her financial pipeline, the defaults triggered. The lenders are suing you because legally you are the guarantor of his fraud." The silence that descended upon the room was thick and suffocating. Patricia stared at the documents, the words slowly dismantling her entire worldview. The golden child, the brilliant financial mind she had paraded in front of her country club friends, evaporated into thin air. In his place sat a desperate thief who had strapped an explosive debt to her name to save his own skin. She looked at Derek. Her hands stopped trembling, replaced by a terrifying, unnatural stillness. "Is this true?" she asked, her voice dropping to a hollow whisper. Derek shrank back into his chair, unable to meet her gaze. "Mom, I can explain," he stammered, his voice cracking. "The market shifted. I was trying to build a secondary portfolio for you. I was trying to secure our legacy." Patricia stood up. Her chair scraped sharply against the floor. She walked down the length of the conference table, her heels clicking in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Derek flinched, bracing himself. Patricia stopped next to his chair. She raised her right hand and struck him across the face. The sound cracked through the quiet room, sharp and echoing. The impact snapped Derek's head to the side, leaving a vivid red handprint blooming across his pale cheek. He did not raise his hands to defend himself. He simply sat there, absorbing the physical manifestation of her shattered reality. "You stole my name," Patricia hissed, her voice venomous. "You risked our home. You ruined us." Amanda burst into tears, burying her face in her hands. Gerald removed his glasses, rubbing his eyes with a profound, weary sorrow. The family unit that had ambushed me with such arrogant entitlement just days prior was tearing itself apart right in front of me. Patricia turned away from her son. She walked back toward my end of the table, her posture morphing from fury into something deeply pathetic. She gripped the edge of the wood, leaning toward me. Her eyes were red-rimmed, pleading. "Justine," she pleaded, the arrogance entirely stripped away. "You have the resources. You manage global supply chains. You can cover this loan. We can sign a repayment agreement. We will give you the deed to the lake house as collateral. You cannot let them take our primary residence. You are still part of this family. You have to help us." I looked at the woman who had sneered at my career, who had deemed my own father unworthy of medical assistance. She was begging for salvation from the very person she had spent years diminishing. The irony tasted metallic and deeply satisfying. I stood up, gathering my coat from the back of the chair. I buttoned the wool fabric, smoothing the lapels with deliberate, unhurried movements. I looked at Patricia, then at Gerald, and finally at Amanda. "I am not part of this family," I said, my voice steady and cold. "And I am not a bank." Patricia reached out her fingers, brushing the sleeve of my coat. "Please, Justine," she wept. "What are we supposed to do?" I looked her directly in the eyes. I delivered the exact words her son had weaponized against me on that freezing New Hampshire morning. "Your son is your problem." I turned and walked toward the exit. I opened the heavy oak door, stepping out into the hallway without looking back. The sound of Patricia's renewed sobbing mixed with Gerald's raised voice echoed behind me, muffled only when the door clicked firmly shut. The parasite had been excised. The host was free. But as I rode the elevator down to the lobby, I knew one final task remained. The legal dissolution of the marriage was imminent, and Derek still owed me restitution for the original theft. He was about to discover that escaping his parents' wrath was nothing compared to facing the final decree of a judge. The Merrimack County Superior Court building carried a distinct atmosphere of institutional finality. The high ceilings and polished marble floors amplified the sharp, rhythmic clicks of Valerie Sterling walking down the corridor beside me. We entered the courtroom for a hearing scheduled to last barely 20 minutes. The air smelled faintly of floor wax and old paper, a sterile environment designed to strip away emotion and replace it with cold, binding arithmetic. Derek sat at the respondent's table. He looked diminished, a faded ghost of the arrogant finance manager who used to parade through our home dictating boundaries. His attorney sat next to him, projecting an aura of quiet, professional surrender. There would be no trial today. There would be no dramatic cross-examination or passionate opening statements. When a lawyer holds the physical, digital evidence of federal wire fraud and identity theft, the opposing counsel does not fight the current. They advise their client to drown quietly. Valerie had drafted a master settlement agreement that read less like a marital negotiation and more like an unconditional surrender. To avoid my forwarding the forged power of attorney documents directly to the district attorney, Derek conceded every single asset we possessed. The judge, a stern man with silver hair and reading glasses perched low on his nose, reviewed the typed stipulations. He read the terms aloud, his voice echoing against the wood-paneled walls. I retained 100% of my corporate retirement accounts. I kept the deed to the Manchester house free and clear of any encumbrances. The joint savings, including the remaining liquid capital, remained entirely in my possession. Derek walked away with nothing but the clothing in his closet and the modest sedan he currently drove. Then came the matter of the stolen funds. The judge struck his heavy wooden gavel, ordering Derek to repay the embezzled $120,000 in formal restitution. But securing a legal judgment and actually collecting the physical capital are two vastly different realities within the American justice system. This is where the true architecture of his financial ruin became vividly apparent. Derek had assumed establishing the Phantom Delaware Holding Company in his mother's name shielded his own personal income from any potential fallout. He thought he could use Patricia's identity as a blast shield. He was wrong. Commercial lenders who underwrite high-risk offshore debts operate with ruthless efficiency. They do not hand over hundreds of thousands of dollars to an empty shell corporation without requiring a concrete safety net. To secure the initial borrowed capital, Derek had signed a personal guarantee. He had legally pledged his own future earnings as collateral against the corporate default. The moment the limited liability company imploded, the creditors pierced the corporate veil. They bypassed the empty shell company, bypassed his panicked mother, and went straight for the guarantor. A secondary court order had already authorized a maximum legal garnishment of his wages. Before his bi-weekly paycheck ever reached his bank account, the collection agencies skimmed the vast majority of his earnings. He was working 40 hours a week just to pay the compounding interest on a debt he could never mathematically clear. The court mandate for my restitution sat at the very end of a long line of aggressive institutional creditors. I knew I might never see that specific money returned to my ledger, but the financial execution was satisfying enough. He had weaponized the concept of keeping his money to himself. Now the state ensured he would never keep a single dime he earned for the next 2 decades. He was a wage slave to his own hubris. The judge finalized the decree. The gavel struck the sounding block a final time, officially severing the marriage. I stood up, buttoning my tailored blazer. Derek remained seated, staring blankly at the polished wooden table. He had lost his wife, his wealth, his reputation, and his family. The isolation he constructed was total and inescapable. I walked out of the courtroom, stepping into the crisp New Hampshire air. The weight of the last 4 years vanished, replaced by the clean, sharp oxygen of true independence. 3 weeks passed. I settled back into the demanding rhythm of global supply chain management. The medical tech industry was surging, requiring late nights coordinating international freight logistics across complex shipping channels. I was sitting at my executive desk, reviewing a quarterly budget forecast, when my direct office line rang. The caller ID displayed an unfamiliar local number. I answered, expecting a vendor negotiating shipping rates or a warehouse manager reporting a delay. "Justine," a voice said. The tone was thin, hesitant, and laced with a raw, desperate edge. It took me a moment to place the cadence. It was Amanda. I leaned back in my leather chair, signaling my assistant through the glass partition to hold my incoming calls. I remained silent, letting the discomfort stretch across the cellular connection. "I know you probably hate me," Amanda continued, her breath catching slightly. "And I know I have no right to ask you for anything after the way we treated you. But I am entirely out of options." She began to speak rapidly, detailing the rapid deterioration of her parents' estate. Patricia and Gerald were drowning under the weight of the commercial lawsuit. They had listed the luxurious lake house for emergency liquidation and were currently attempting to downsize to a small apartment on the outskirts of the city. The luxury imported cars were gone, repossessed by the banks. The country club memberships were canceled. Amanda had lost her subsidized housing and her premium auto lease. The boutique art gallery where she worked part-time had reduced her shifts, leaving her unable to afford basic utilities. The elite facade of their existence had burned to ash, leaving them standing in the rubble. I saw your company posted an opening for a senior administrative coordinator, Amanda said, the pleading tone naked and stripped of her usual arrogance. I have office experience. I am organized. I just need a steady paycheck, Justine. The starting salary is enough to help my parents secure a rental deposit. I will work overtime. I will do whatever the department needs. Please, can you just put in a recommendation for me with your human resources department? I listened to the woman who had openly mocked my grueling 60-hour work weeks. The same woman who sneered at my career while using the fruits of my labor to fund her high-end day spa appointments and designer wardrobe. She was now begging for an entry-level position within the very industry her brother had tried to destroy through his offshore margin betting. I did not raise my voice. I did not gloat or offer a venomous lecture. True power lies in polite, immovable boundaries. Amanda, I said, keeping my tone perfectly level and professional. The medical tech sector requires individuals who demonstrate high ethical standards and impeccable reliability. Given the recent financial history of your family and the ongoing fraud investigations tied to your household, I cannot, in good conscience, sponsor your application. The line fell silent, save for the ragged sound of her breathing. Justine, please, she sobbed, the last of her pride breaking. You are punishing me for what Derek did. We are going to be homeless. I am not punishing you, Amanda, I replied smoothly, matching the exact cadence her brother had used in my kitchen months ago. I am simply making a strategic corporate allocation. Good luck with your job search. I pressed the disconnect button. The line went dead. I placed the receiver back onto the cradle, turning my attention to the budget forecast glowing on my monitor. The numbers aligned perfectly. The supply chain was secure. The hostile assets were liquidated. The story of Derek and his entitled family had officially reached its conclusion, leaving me with nothing but a clear horizon and the freedom to chart my own course. Autumn arrived in New Hampshire, bringing a vibrant canopy of burnt orange and gold across the Belknap Mountains. 6 months had passed since the heavy wooden gavel struck the sounding block in the Merrimack County Courthouse. I sat on the expansive wooden deck of a rented cabin overlooking the pristine waters of Lake Winnipesaukee. The morning air carried a sharp, clean bite, smelling of pine needles and damp earth. A gentle breeze rolled across the lake surface, creating 1,000 tiny silver ripples that caught the early sun. I held a ceramic mug of dark roast coffee, letting the heat radiate through my palms. For the first time in nearly 5 years, I did not feel the phantom weight of impending disaster resting on my shoulders. I was not auditing a crisis. I was not tracking a deception. I was simply existing. Inside the cabin, my mother, Maria, stood by the kitchen counter slicing fresh apples. My father, Carlos, sat at the rustic dining table reading the morning newspaper. He looked healthy. The gray tone that had clouded his complexion during his heart troubles was gone, replaced by a robust, steady color. His hands still bore the pale scars of his manufacturing days, but they rested easily on the table, free of the tremors that anxiety usually brought. 3 months ago, I walked into the Regional Cardiology Center and handed the billing department a certified check for $18,400. I cleared the balance of his emergency stent procedure in a single transaction. When the clerk stamped the invoice paid in full, I felt a profound shift in my internal architecture. The capital that Derek had stolen, the exact sum he had gambled away on a petty, vindictive margin bet, had been restored. My father never had to worry about collection agencies or damaged credit. He was safe. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the dark liquid warm my throat. I looked out at the distant tree line, thinking about the man who had tried to build a financial empire on my back. News travels in highly predictable currents within small professional circles. I did not go looking for updates on my former husband, but the information found me through the inevitable grapevine of mutual acquaintances. Derek no longer walked the polished floors of his downtown financial firm. When a licensed broker incurs a federal fraud investigation and a staggering commercial default, the corporate sector closes its doors permanently. His financial licenses were revoked, ending his career in an instant. He was currently employed at a mid-level logistics warehouse, working a position that required him to clock in before sunrise to load freight onto delivery trucks. Every second Friday, his new employer issued a paycheck, and every second Friday, the state garnishment orders intercepted those earnings before they ever reached his bank account. The creditor skimmed the maximum allowable percentage, leaving him with barely enough capital to secure basic necessities. He lived in a cramped one-bedroom apartment situated near a noisy industrial park on the outskirts of the city. He drove a 10-year-old sedan with a failing transmission because the bank had seized his leased vehicle months ago. The pristine Italian leather briefcase he used to carry with such unearned arrogance was likely gathering dust in a dark closet, a relic of a life he could no longer afford to pretend he lived. But the financial ruin was only a fraction of his punishment. The true poetic justice lay in the fractured ruins of his family tree. Patricia and Gerald had lost the sprawling estate in the suburbs. The commercial lenders had placed a lien on the property, forcing a rapid sale to cover a portion of the Phantom Holding Company debt. The remaining equity vanished into legal fees. The couple, who used to complain about the rising cost of organic produce from the patio of their exclusive country club, now resided in a modest two-bedroom rental unit next to a busy highway. They drove a single compact car. The luxury European river cruises and catered holiday parties were ancient history. Patricia had traded her elite charity luncheons for clipping grocery store coupons. The strain of the collapse had shattered their relationship with their son. According to the rumors floating through our old neighborhood, Patricia refused to speak to Derek. She blamed him entirely for the destruction of her pristine social standing. Gerald followed his wife's lead, cutting off all communication. Amanda, having failed to secure an administrative position at my medical tech firm, had moved out of state. The woman who once scoffed at my long corporate hours was now working a retail management job in a cheaper housing market, folding sweaters to make her rent. Derek was entirely isolated. I set my coffee mug down on the wooden railing. A flock of wild geese moved in a loose formation across the pale blue sky, their distant calls echoing over the water. I remembered the morning in my kitchen, when the frost coated the windows. I remembered Derek snapping his briefcase shut and looking at me with cold, dismissive eyes. I remembered the exact cadence of his voice when he delivered the ultimatum that started this entire war. Your parents are your problem. The sheer irony of that statement now formed a perfect closed circle. He had demanded strict financial boundaries to avoid helping the man who raised me. He had told me to handle my own family. Now his parents were legally and literally his problem. He had forged his mother's signature and tethered her to a catastrophic debt. He had destroyed their retirement and forced them into a tiny rental unit. They were his responsibility, but he possessed zero capital to fix the disaster he created. He was trapped in a cage of his own making, working physical labor 40 hours a week just to pay the compounding interest on a lie. I turned away from the railing and looked back through the sliding glass door. My father laughed at something my mother said, the sound rich and warm. The scene embodied everything Derek had tried to dismiss as a burden. He viewed family as a transaction, a ledger of debits and credits. He did not understand that true wealth resides in the people who stand by you when the supply chain breaks. I had spent 6 years contorting myself to fit into a marriage built on a foundation of hidden exploitation. I had allowed my labor to be siphoned, my professional success to be treated as a threat, and my family to be viewed as a liability. I had trusted a man who saw my income as his personal slush fund, but the freeze of that winter morning had thawed, revealing the hard, unyielding stone beneath. The Granite State motto, "Live free or die," is often interpreted as a call for political rebellion. But sitting on that deck, I understood the phrase on a deeply personal level. Living free is not about avoiding taxes or ignoring societal rules. Living free is the fierce, unapologetic protection of your own worth. It is the willingness to sever the ties that bind you to parasites, even when those ties are woven from years of shared history. It is the courage to look at a hostile asset and liquidate it without a single drop of regret. My medical tech firm was thriving. My private savings accounts were growing exponentially. My career trajectory was pointed upward, guided by my own ambition and unburdened by a partner who secretly bet against my success. I did not need a man to manage my portfolio. I was the portfolio. I picked up my mug and took one final breath of the crisp mountain air. The scent of pine and fresh water filled my lungs, expanding my chest with a sense of profound, untouchable peace. The war was over. The territory was secured. I walked back inside the cabin, closing the glass door behind me, ready to enjoy a quiet breakfast with the people who actually mattered. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope my journey serves as a stark reminder that true partnership requires transparency, and that you should never apologize for defending your own value. If you found yourself in my kitchen, holding that medical bill on that freezing winter morning, how would you have handled Derek's initial ultimatum? Would you have audited the accounts? Or would you have demanded an immediate confrontation? Leave your thoughts in the comments section below. I read every single one. If this narrative resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel. We explore stories of resilience, justice, and the power of walking away every single week. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next one. There is a silent inheritance we pass down to our children, one that rarely appears on a bank statement or within the pages of a last will and testament. It is not the colonial house in the quiet American suburbs, the carefully managed college fund, or the heirloom jewelry tucked away in a velvet box. Our true legacy is the architecture of love, respect, and boundaries we build within the walls of our homes. In American culture, we are often raised on a very specific, deeply ingrained myth regarding the traditional family structure. We are taught that endurance is the ultimate virtue. We are told that keeping the family unit intact at all costs is the highest form of parental responsibility. But as we strip back the polished veneer of modern domestic life, peering into the quiet kitchens and sterile deposition rooms of the stories we have shared, a much harder, more complex truth emerges about what we owe the next generation. Think about the mothers and wives who slowly erase themselves to keep the peace. There is a profound danger in the romanticized ideal of the selfless parent, the mother who eats the cold leftovers while the family celebrates without her, the spouse who absorbs chronic emotional neglect, the partner who smiles through the profound loneliness of an empty marriage. We often package this self-erasure as a noble sacrifice for the sake of the children, but children are brilliant, silent observers. They do not merely listen to our lectures on fairness and honesty. They absorb our lived realities. When a parent shrinks to accommodate disrespect, they are writing a subconscious manual for their children on how to navigate the world. They are teaching their daughters to expect less and their sons to demand more without consequence. True family responsibility is not about maintaining a flawless two-parent facade for the neighborhood to admire. It requires the exhausting, terrifying work of emotional awareness. It demands that we ask ourselves not just, are my children fed, but what kind of love am I modeling for them today? Honesty within a family is rarely about the grand, dramatic confessions. It is forged in the daily currency of truth. When a father orchestrates an elaborate lie to siphon funds, or when a husband uses the clinical language of financial boundaries to mask a staggering hidden addiction, the betrayal extends far beyond the marital bed. It infects the entire lineage. Raising children with a strong moral compass requires parents to live in the light, practicing fairness not as an abstract concept, but as a daily domestic habit. When parents hide behind forged signatures, fabricated business trips, or secret bank accounts, they do not merely steal money or time. They steal the foundational trust that allows a human being to feel safe in the world. A child raised in a house built on secrets will eventually feel the floorboards rotting beneath their feet, even if they lack the vocabulary to name the decay. This brings us to a viewpoint that deeply contradicts the conventional wisdom of traditional family values. For generations, society has whispered that a broken home is the greatest tragedy a child can endure. We are conditioned to believe that divorce, separation, and the fracturing of the nuclear family are the ultimate failures of parenting. We are told to stay for the kids, to absorb the blow to keep the illusion alive. But the stories of survival, betrayal, and financial warfare we have explored teach us something entirely different, something undeniably radical. Sometimes the most profound act of family responsibility is tearing the physical family structure down to the studs. We must fundamentally redefine what a broken home actually is. A home is not broken when one parent bravely walks away from emotional abuse, infidelity, or financial predation. A home is broken when it normalizes disrespect under the guise of loyalty. It is broken when a spouse is treated as an unpaid servant, or when a mother is abandoned in a hospital recovery room to manage newborn twins alone. By refusing to tolerate the intolerable, a parent provides the ultimate long-term guidance. They demonstrate to their watching children that love does not mean enduring cruelty. They show that peace is not the absence of conflict, but the fierce, unapologetic protection of one's own soul. When a mother packs her bags in the middle of the night or sits across a mahogany table to legally dismantle a toxic partner, she is not failing her children. She is giving them a parent who is whole, rather than a parent who is hollow. Raising emotionally aware children in today's world means showing them that empathy has strict boundaries. We desperately want our children to be kind, to be forgiving, and to honor their commitments. But we must also teach them the vital difference between supporting a loved one and being consumed by them. As we navigate the complexities of modern American life, where the relentless pressures of success, wealth accumulation, and social appearances can so easily warp our priorities, we must anchor our families in authentic connection. We must teach our children that true respect is earned through consistent, honest action, not demanded through a familial title. The lessons embedded in these betrayals and quiet rebellions are not just cautionary tales. They are mirrors held up to our own lives. They force us to examine the quiet compromises we make in our own living rooms. Are we modeling the kind of partnership we hope our children will one day find? Are we living with the fierce independence and unbreakable self-respect we want to pass down to them? If you find yourself questioning the foundation of your own narrative, or if you simply find comfort in the shared human experience of falling apart and bravely rebuilding, I invite you to join our community. Subscribe to Sarah Told Stories, where we will continue to explore the raw, unfiltered moments that force us to rewrite our destinies. Let's keep navigating these complex waters together. As you step away from this story and look around the quiet reality of your own life, ask yourself what invisible lessons you are leaving behind. Leave the myths of endless, silent endurance in the past, because the greatest inheritance you will ever leave your children is not a unified household built on a foundation of quiet suffering. The greatest inheritance you will ever leave them is the undeniable proof that you had the courage to save yourself.